Hello again, and welcome to this video on the origins and the writers of the Renaissance, which covers SOL 2B of World History 2. Now, we will describe the artistic, literary, and intellectual ideas of the Renaissance by creating a list-style blog post introducing your online readers to this information, the information from this video, all about the Renaissance. So you got to be ready for that as you're watching through this video so that you can be prepared to actually make a blog post, and we'll work on that in class. But let's think first about why learn all this stuff. Why learn everything about the 1500s? Why learn about the Renaissance? Well, in the big picture, the trends and processes that you can see developing here set off a chain of events which eventually lead to the Industrial Revolution, America, imperialism, the Ninja Turtles, and the modern world in general. We as people living today think very differently and lead very different lives than people did before 1500. So it's worth studying about all this stuff. Now, historians are fond of putting names on time periods that have recognizable features. They sort of separate them from one another into these stretches of times called eras or periods. And the process of doing that is called periodization. And do you know what historians love even more than splitting things into periods? Proving that they don't exist. Naysaying other historians. Anyway, historical eras, as you can see here on this timeline, which is one of those timelines that goes from top to bottom, you see this pre-modern era from the prehistoric, the ancient, and all the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance. Well, just after the Renaissance, really, is when the modern era starts, which the world was in all the way up until they sort of put it in 1948. But as I said before, historians love to argue about when things were and when they are not. So you'll find lots of different dates for that. So in this video, we're moving on to the Renaissance, one of those periods that may or may not have ever happened. But I should say here that nobody disputes the facts of what happened. The arguments center on what those facts mean and the interpretation of those facts. For instance, nobody is saying that Shakespeare never lived or that he didn't write his plays. Actually, that's a really terrible example because people do actually argue that he didn't write his plays. But Michelangelo, though, he definitely painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling, which you can see right here, and Michelangelo himself. So what was the Renaissance, you ask? Well, let's begin with what it looked like. I wandered around the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts to find out. And so first, here's what European art looked like before the Renaissance. See how there's just these sort of people, and they're like chilling, but it's all sort of flat looking. It's weird. It's not great perspective, and the people look kind of like humans, but it's not very convincing. Over here on the Renaissance side, you can see the use of lighting is incredible, and there's that guy throwing the gang sign, and there are all these other people who have unique and interesting expressions on their face. They look like individual people who have lives that you could learn about. That's the difference, the depth of character and interest and skill with paint and lots of other artistic mediums. So what you should notice is the power, perspective, detail, realism, and emotion. The Middle Ages, they're mostly concerned with death. That was pretty much like we saw in the Medieval Mind documentary. And their art was flat and beautiful, but otherworldly and sort of static, stuck. The Renaissance was also a time of opulence. I love that word. It means great wealth or luxury. And in this time period, princes and merchants alike were amassing enormous collections of luxury goods like silk and porcelain, gold, silver, jewels, and works of art, all while spreading rich spices on their foods. So cities and local rulers were building these massive monumental buildings along Greek and Roman designs. And it's important to mention here that the Renaissance really means rebirth. Specifically, later writers saw this time period as the flowering of European culture that had been lost after the fall of the Roman Empire. So it's a later bunch of people who actually called this a Renaissance, but again, historians naming things after they happen. So what made all of the Renaissance possible? A few things. It started in Italy, and Italy had some significant advantages during this time period. It was the center of the Christian religion, and nearly all trade from the east flowed through Venice and Genoa, which were major Italian city-states. The relative stability of trade coming from the east, combined with Venice and Genoa's dominance, meant that huge amounts of wealth were concentrated right there. In the course of a century, though, the Renaissance spread west to Spain and north through France, Germany, England, and especially into the Low Countries, like through what is now the Netherlands and through Amsterdam. So here you can see the spread starting here in Italy, and you can see all these, the blue lines are Venice's trade routes, the purple lines are Venice and Genoa's trade routes that head all the way up here, and these are northern European trade routes to the sea. But you can see these green arrows traveling all to Spain, to France, to England, to the Low Countries, to Germany. Now, the economic causes of the Renaissance are really fascinating. The economic system of Europe was really confusing and hard to work with during the Middle Ages. Nearly every major trading power had its own currency, and there were no easy ways to exchange money. Also, the numerous nobles of Europe were in constant conflict with one another. Remember how complicated the map of Europe was when we looked at it in Europa Universalis? Well, once you get up to 1700, you see consistent standing armies of each nation, paid through the royal treasury, but leading up to during the Renaissance, rulers supplemented their noble troops with mercenaries, and mercenaries expected to get paid. So because you didn't have national standing armies, you had these very expensive armies of mercenaries you had to pay. And your income as a noble, and especially as a king, was probably insufficient to keep up with the new amount of both weapons and consumer goods that you were expected to own. So that's like cannons, but also like tapestries and china for your house. And your income, because you were a noble, was based on farming. So loans to cover the amount that you needed above farming each year quickly became a way of solving that problem. Wealthy merchants in Italy loaned money for repayment, sometimes with interest, like sneaky interest, but often for political favors or to gain a monopoly grant, so you could be the only person doing a kind of business. The availability of loans and later paper notes of exchange made it possible to increase the amount of money available at any time. And beyond warfare, this also meant it was possible for rulers to hand out loads of money to writers and thinkers and artists to create for them. So loans from banks made nobles wealthy through loans, so in debt, and they then paid for art. So loans equals art in this case. There was a consumer culture, kind of like what you see today, but mostly amongst the rich. It eventually spreads down, but it takes hundreds of years. Competition for the magnificence and opulence, like I said before, began to cause competition in art and obtaining art objects. And especially after this, the invention and spread of the printing press made written ideas travel quickly, and so all of these social elements of the drive for trade and trade goods became quickly spread across Europe. Now, the people of the Renaissance, you'll get to meet the visual artists of the Renaissance in another video, which is much cooler than I'm capable of making. But before we move on to that, let's talk about the people who were the writers. There was Erasmus, so let's talk about that guy. He's worth talking about because first, well, he was born first, and he was in a group of thinkers that we today call the Humanists. That name comes from another one of those ism words that we'll be studying all year, humanism. Now, that term means something very different than today than it did in the Renaissance. Today it has a strong connection with atheism, from the Greek word ethios, meaning without God or gods. But humanists first applied to Erasmus and company in the early 1800s, so 300 years after Erasmus lived. Those historians took the name from the Latin expression literatae humanores, the more human letters. They lumped together all the thinkers who rejected medieval thought, like we saw in the documentary, and their writing instead idealized the literature of Greece and Rome from well over 1,000 years before their time. Humanists of the Renaissance saw Greek and Roman writing as more connected to the real world and not just the spiritual. Though they were by no means atheists, these thinkers do mark an important split from the medieval mind. Their writings had purposes and styles that were far more secular or non-religious, in part because they drew their ideas from Greeks and Romans who were not Christians. This was a big deal, though, and it gave Erasmus the mental space to criticize the church for flaws that seem obvious to us today, like the hypocrisy of some of the laws and the indulgences, which we'll talk about later, the opulence of the church when they're mostly should be focused on heaven, and the violence that the church perpetrated against its own people and against people abroad. So these more secular ideas also influenced art, as you'll get to see in the next video. And some writers at the time, and definitely later historians, see this period of thought as a kind of emancipation from the oppressive Middle Ages. And that emancipation is a theme we'll follow through much of the Renaissance and Reformation. So the next person who's important covers the theme of individualism, and that's William Shakespeare. Because individualism is visible in his essays and plays during this time period. Shakespeare was a playwright in England who lived in the last days of what we call the Renaissance. He wrote beautiful sonnets, which is a kind of metered poem, but what he's most remembered for today are his plays. In the Middle Ages, there were not too many complex characters in drama. There were simple, flat characters who displayed one part of human nature. One character might be just wrathful or angry, or they might be, an old man character. But in Shakespeare's plays, you get to see the many sides of a single character, making them more human. Take Polonius from the play Hamlet, for instance. You see him working with the king, and when he's with the king, he's a flatterer. When he's a royal advisor to the queen, he's overconfident. When he's a father to his daughter, he's kind of uncaring, doesn't really pay attention to her. When he's a father to his son, he's kind and wise. And this idea of character was extended to a very specific individual by a French essayist named Montaigne. And he wrote about a character near and dear to his heart, himself. He looked inward and picked out many perspectives and pieces of himself, something I hope to help you do throughout this year. See how that works? Their ideas all fit together. Secular ideas taken from Greece and Rome, reworked by the Renaissance thinkers, led to an emancipation of thought from the Catholic Church that allowed more interesting individualism. That's just one of the many ways those ideas fit together during this time period. But here's a larger issue. Before we go on, especially before you see the next video, I want to introduce you to one of the major themes in world history, and all of history really, gender. In the next video, you will watch a cartoon character lead you through the Renaissance art, but it's made by a great group that does these funny art history videos. They use a term that you may have heard before and you will almost certainly hear again, Renaissance man. It has to come to mean someone who was accomplished in many areas of craft or art or knowledge. This particularly applies to Leonardo da Vinci, who basically did everything from painting to siege engines. But the issue here is that second word, man. In the early days of English, man used to refer to all humans, as in, all people they considered humans. We have stopped doing this, using man to mean all humans. In your English classes, you may have been told to write his and her, or he and she. Today we try to bring at least two genders in, while in the past, in many cases, it was assumed that you meant humans. So if it was acceptable then, when these Renaissance men actually lived to do that, why argue about it now? Because today, when we say Renaissance man, we do leave out women. Perhaps we wouldn't if we intentionally included women in lists of Renaissance artists and thinkers, but as you'll see in the SOLs in the next video, they totally leave them out. So, because we don't have time in this video to spend on all the incredible women of the Renaissance, let's focus on Marie de Gournay. She was closely connected to Montaigne, the essayist from earlier, and she practically adopted him as a father. She collected, translated, and commented brilliantly on Montaigne's work after his death, and she wrote on the equality of men and women in 1622. And she also wrote a few other texts advocating for that same ideal. Basically, she argued that if what makes a human is the presence of a soul, which a lot of people believed at the time as Christians, and theologians agreed that no one had any more soul than anyone else, which they agreed at a conference for that, then men and women both must be human and equally human, therefore equally souled and equally valuable. So here's her quote: "Man and woman are so much one that if man is more than woman, then woman is more than man." Boom. Also, I should mention here that even the division between man and woman is a social construct, but we'll definitely have time for that later, and we don't have time for it now. Good evening.